The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Tim Donner is on vacation this week. I'm Greg Corombos, news director at the Radio American Network and co-host of the always fun Martini Lunch podcast. We have a very full show for you this week. You already know that the government wastes your tax dollars at an alarming rate, right? Well, today, OpenTheBooks.com founder and CEO Adam Andrzejewski joins us to reveal how the Small Business Administration spent roughly $170 billion over 5 years and how much of it actually went to mom-and-pop businesses. We'll also be joined by LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza to discuss the legal aftermath of Jeffrey Epstein's death, the Justice Department's push for expedited capital punishment, and much more. China expert Gordon Chang will be here to provide his analysis into the Hong Kong protests and the demand of those people for freedom. We'll also talk about China's response and how President Trump ought to be addressing this. But up first, the gun debate. In the wake of the El Paso and Dayton mass shootings, the calls for gun legislation are as loud as ever. And this time, some Republicans are part of the chorus. President Trump is calling for expanded background checks and also appears sympathetic to what are called red flag laws. These red flag laws are becoming a topic of fierce debate on the right, and Liberty Nation ought to be no different. I recently spoke with former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney Andrew McCarthy and Gun Owners of America legal counsel Mike Hammond. Andy McCarthy is a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, but thinks red flag laws can be an effective way to preserve liberty while providing a tool to take a closer look at a gun owner who might be a threat.
Well, the idea, Greg, would be that if somebody exhibits the kind of behavior that would concern reasonable people in terms of the person's access to firearms, they would be able to, whether it was through the police, some versions of this would only allow this through the police. Other versions would let anyone make the application, but you'd have to make an application to a court, and the judge, on some standard of proof with rigorous due process protections for the person who is at issue, would have to make a determination whether to cut off that person's access to firearms for either some finite period of time or, depending on what the disability was and the proof of it was, it could be longer than that.
Mike Hammond disagrees. He says red flag laws would begin a slippery slope for gun owners, and he argues that such laws would not have prevented the most recent mass shootings or many others.
Red flag laws, they exist in California. They didn't do anything to stop the Gilroy shooter. They wouldn't have done anything to stop the El Paso shooter, and they wouldn't have done anything to stop the Dayton shooter unless you think red flags are going to impose a gun ban on people on the basis of a high school suspension a decade ago. If that's what you think red flags are going, then I can tell you that a disproportionate number of people who are suspended from high school are minorities. And what you're doing effectively is imposing Jim Crow all over again. Lindsey Graham, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, is basically pushing these gun confiscation order, red flag things. I think there's a lot of resistance to a program which allows a relative who's angry at you, an angry aunt, an angry ex, whatever, to call a judge in the middle of the night and just allege you're dangerous, and by doing nothing more than that, strip you of constitutional rights. The first thing you would learn is that when the SWAT team arrived at your home in the middle of the night, and there have been instances, a 62-year-old black gentleman in Ferndale, Maryland, who was shot to death by police serving one of these red flag orders because an angry aunt didn't like his politics.
McCarthy says every law has the potential for abuse, but that doesn't mean we should get rid of them all. However, he does say Republicans need to be very careful about how red flag legislation is crafted, and that lawmakers would be wise to remove any incentives for frivolous use of such laws.
Well, I think, Greg, you've raised the most important one, which is that it can't be very easy to make this application, because I think you're quite right. If it is, we have a long history of people who are willing to, especially interest group connected people who have a philosophical opposition to Second Amendment rights and who think that God is on their side and therefore, well, if they believe in God, but in other words, they think they're in the right, and it doesn't matter if they go in and they file a frivolous or a dishonest petition because they're on the side of all that is good and just and right. And I think that is the biggest hurdle. You have to have a real and colorable threat. So I think what probably Congress should think about doing is itemizing the kinds of behavior that would justify a motion and require a fairly high standard. I'm not saying beyond a reasonable doubt, but I think we do have to be mindful of the idea that there could be frivolous petitions. What I would do is I would very seriously consider having a loser pays provision, so that it would cost people who made these frivolous applications.
So the debate continues. Congress will be back in town in just a few weeks, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said he hopes to pass something when lawmakers return. Still to come on Liberty Nation, we'll find out just how little the Small Business Administration is helping small businesses. We'll also talk about the week's most significant liberty-related legal news with Scott Cosenza of LibertyNation.com. And when we come back, China expert Gordon Chang on the freedom demands of the Hong Kong protesters, what China's doing now, and what Trump should be doing. Right back.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Our guest now is Gordon Chang. He's a China expert and the author of The Coming Collapse of China. We've asked him to comment on the rising tensions in Hong Kong, the pro-democracy demands of the demonstrators, and what Beijing is planning to do in response. And, of course, we want to know what he thinks the U.S. position ought to be as this all plays out. We'll discuss it all in the next few minutes. And, Gordon, thanks as always for being with us.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Greg.
You and I have talked about this already this year. We talked back when the protesters were in the streets demanding the withdrawal of the extradition bill, which we can certainly say has not passed. It has been pulled but not officially withdrawn, which is one of the demands of the demonstrators. So without the legislature taking this back up again, why are these huge protests still continuing with the same intensity?
Now they've got the 5 demands, which of course includes the withdrawal of the extradition bill. But really what's happening here in a larger sense is that people in Hong Kong, and not just the pro-democracy kids on the streets, but also a very large segment of the Hong Kong population, just believe that this is their last stand for autonomy. And that's why we don't hear very much carping about the violent tactics of the kids, because most people in Hong Kong, and we're talking 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the people, are focusing more on the brutal tactics of the police, the intransigence of Carrie Lam, the Hong Kong chief executive, the top political officer, and also Beijing's encroachment on their way of life. So this is a society struggle against China.
And the Hong Kong police now that we've seen in recent weeks, more recently certainly, the response has not been as peaceful, and in some cases the protesters have not been as peaceful. Who exactly are the Hong Kong police answering to right now?
I don't think they're answering to the Hong Kong Commissioner of Police. I think that essentially we're seeing Beijing dictate what's going on. And there have been some very interesting videos recently. One of them from about a week ago shows a Hong Kong riot officer. And he's obviously from Hong Kong because he speaks colloquial Cantonese. But then he turns to other riot troops next to him, and he starts speaking to them in Mandarin. And one Hong Kong police officer would not speak in Mandarin to colleagues. And then the Hong Kong riot officer addresses his fellows with the word comrade. So this follows also some videos which are on YouTube, which show people in Hong Kong police uniforms who, first of all, can't show their Hong Kong police identity cards and who obviously don't understand Cantonese in a Cantonese-speaking city. All of this suggests that China has put in its either People's Armed Police or maybe even People's Liberation Army personnel into Hong Kong streets wearing Hong Kong police officer garb.
What's your assessment, Gordon, of how Xi Jinping and his regime have addressed the protests to date? And I know it's changing, as we just discussed. And what do you see as their plan going forward?
Yeah, Xi Jinping has taken a hard line. Before he became General Secretary of the Communist Party in 2012, he actually had the Hong Kong portfolio on the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the highest decision-making body in the Communist Party and therefore in China itself. He no longer has that portfolio, but the policies that are being implemented today are his policies. And he's obviously not making concessions that are going to please people in Hong Kong. So Carrie Lam, the chief executive, has been giving a series of press conferences which are just tone deaf if you think that she is trying to placate Hong Kong people. But she's probably doesn't care, because what she's doing is addressing an audience of one. And that audience of one is in Beijing. And that person in Beijing, of course, is Xi Jinping. So he's taking a pretty hard-line stance. And right now, it's basically no compromise.
How do you expect this to go from here? Do you expect more mass protests and more police clashing with the demonstrators? Or is this going to take on a different element now?
Yeah, I think we'll see more clashes. The protesters are very interesting. They have taken the advice of Bruce Lee, the martial arts a film expert, and they say, be like water, which is what Bruce Lee said. Well, these guys are like water. So, for instance, a couple days ago, when they occupied the Hong Kong airport terminal, and then Beijing said their activities were like terrorism. Well, that frightened them. So what they did was they just left the Hong Kong airport and they protested someplace else in Wan Chai on Hong Kong Island. And then they flowed back into the airport for that famous sit-in, which resulted in the violence that we've all talking about. So these guys move very quickly. They're always one step ahead of the police. And I think that we're going to find that they are going to, engage in protests. China will try and catch them, but for the meantime, Beijing's not having any luck in quelling this at all.
Let's talk about the U.S. position in all of this. On Tuesday, President Trump was asked about this issue, and his comment was, quote, "The Hong Kong thing is a very tough situation. Very tough. We'll see what happens. But I'm sure it will work out. I hope it works out for everybody, including China, by the way." You tweeted that needs to be a whole lot stronger. Why do you think it's not, and what should he be saying?
Yeah, I think he should be saying that the U.S. will impose stern measures on China should it deploy troops of the People's Liberation Army or the People's Armed Police on the streets of Hong Kong. And the reason is that we have a common foe. China is attacking American democracy, and it's attacking the whole notion of representative governance, of democracy itself. And what it's doing in Hong Kong, of course, it's trying to impinge on the freedom of Hong Kong people. So Hong Kong is really our front line. And so to defend our society, we should defend it wherever freedom is jeopardized by the Chinese. And so President Trump's words, he's also said things like, this is just a matter between Hong Kong and China. That is uninspiring and completely inadequate. And President Trump should actually start talking like a traditional American president about our values and what we stand for in the world. We've got to remember that the kids in Hong Kong, they're flying the American flag. They're singing our anthem. They need our help, but we also need their help. And that's why we need stronger language from the White House.
You mentioned this at the top of your last answer, Gordon, but how far should the Trump administration be willing to go publicly or privately in urging China not to crack down here?
Well, I think that we should be telling the Chinese in public and in private that we will, for instance, repeal legislation that gives Hong Kong certain advantages, such as in licensing and exemptions and the rest of it. So those could go away. But also I think that we should be saying to China, look, we are going to put our whole economic relationship on the line, trade, investment, all sorts of commerce, financial flows. We should be doing this anyway for a number of reasons, but Hong Kong gives us an opportunity to use this as leverage. And I think that if the president were to make a statement which was more traditional, then I think the Chinese would back off because they realize that they can't take on the United States across the board at this particular time. So we should be defending ourselves because that would be effective. And I think all the president would need to do would be just to get behind his desk in the Oval Office and tell the Chinese that they stop here.
We're talking with Gordon Chang, East Asia policy expert and author of The Coming Collapse of China. Gordon, I'm not suggesting it would be imminent, but if the United States doesn't take a stronger position here, could Hong Kong in some way be a dress rehearsal for Taiwan?
Well, Xi Jinping obviously was thinking along that line, and there is a relationship between the two because before the large-scale protests started in the middle of June, pro-independence forces on Taiwan were really on the back foot. But since we've seen China actually work on Hong Kong in ways that people in Hong Kong don't like, well, people in Taiwan look at this and say, look, no. Because Xi Jinping himself has made the connection. Hong Kong has a one country, two systems formula of autonomy. Well, Xi Jinping says one country, two systems is also what he wants for Taiwan. And the people in Taiwan can look at this and say, no, we don't want that at all. And that has led to a couple of things that Xi Jinping didn't like. For instance, Tsai Ing-wen, the president of the Republic of China, of Taiwan, won renomination of the Democratic Progressive Party in this January's presidential election. And she probably wasn't going to get that renomination. And also right now, the candidates of the opposition party, the Kuomintang, have had to drop their pro-China positions, at least in public. And it looks like the Democratic Progressive Party candidate, in other words, the president, Tsai Ing-wen, might actually get reelected, which was not a high probability event before what was going on in Taiwan, in Hong Kong became really clear. So Xi Jinping is, as Chinese propagandists say, he's dropping rocks on his own feet.
Gordon, thank you very much for your time today. We always appreciate it very much.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Greg.
Gordon Chang is a China expert and the author of The Coming Collapse of China. Still to come on Liberty Nation, we'll take a look at how much the Small Business Administration is actually helping small businesses. And when we come back, the most important liberty-related legal news of the week with Scott Cosenza of LibertyNation.com. I'm Greg Corombos, sitting in for Tim Donner. We'll be right back.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
I'm Greg Corombos, news director at the Radio America Network and co-host of the 3 Martini Lunch podcast. In for Tim Donner this week. Tim is on vacation and will be back next week. Happy to be joined now by Scott Cosenza, legal affairs editor at LibertyNation.com. Today we are looking at all of the legal news this week as it relates to our liberties. And Scott, it's always good to have you with us.
Hi, Greg.
Well, let's start with the story that had everybody talking last weekend and is still having a lot of people talking as the weekend persists. And that's the story that accused sex trafficker and longtime political financier and fundraiser Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his prison cell last Saturday morning. It's the death that launched 1,000 conspiracy theories. And what we're hearing so far in terms of at least official explanations is that the corrections officers were pretty much derelict on the job, falling asleep, massive overtime, didn't do the checks. That's the official explanation so far. I know that you and Tim talked about Jeffrey Epstein still being in jail on a previous episode and had some reaction when his request for bail was denied. So what do you see as the legal significance now of that bail being denied and Jeffrey Epstein being dead in his prison cell as of last weekend?
To the bail denial question, I think that it's important to remember that Epstein was denied bail because he was a rich guy. So the judge said that his great wealth gave him access to leave the jurisdiction, and that's why he was denying him bail in major part. Now, the problem with that is, just like you're not supposed to give a rich guy special treatment in the justice system, he's also not supposed to get worse treatment because he happens to be exceedingly wealthy. Mr. Epstein put forth an agreement where he would basically agree to any provision that the court wanted to impose on him, Greg. I joked about it in my piece for LibertyNation.com that he agreed to wear like an explosive collar where he would have to dial in every couple hours, to keep it from blowing up. Like, that's how much this guy wanted to stay out of jail. And unfortunately, this is what happened when he was subject to it.
But since he is rich and he did have this island, was he not a greater flight risk than the average person being accused of something like this?
Well, the island exists in the United States, so that's one thing. It's not a foreign island, right? So if he were to go there, he could be removed and taken back to custody. But just in terms of the extreme offers that he went to go to agree to basically offer any bail condition that the judge might agree to, Greg, he said, I'll wear a tracking monitor, a GPS tracking monitor, and I will pay, meaning Mr. Epstein says he will pay for court personnel to live at his home to basically oversee that he's not undertaking any plans for flight. I mean, he offered to do anything and everything possible to accommodate on his own dime. And let's remember that bail and pretrial detention is only designed to ensure presence at trial. Mr. Epstein had not been convicted. I mean, the headlines run rampant calling him all sorts of things, but he hasn't been convicted newly, and obviously now won't be tried at all since he's dead.
Let's assume for a moment that the explanation we're getting for how this happened is entirely true. What does it say about our prison system and our correction system that this type of incompetence happened in this situation, and you have to assume more than this?
Greg, I think the important takeaway for everyone is if this happens to Epstein, what do you think happens to the run-of-the-mill prisoner in the federal system? And then what about the run-of-the-mill prisoner in the state system? What we do and how we treat our prisoners in the United States is shameful, and that's one of the reasons why I always say when there's any new law proposed, is this worth throwing our neighbors in a cage for? Because that's what we're talking about.
All right, let's move on to another issue related to the Justice Department, because Attorney General Bill Barr has said he's going to continue looking into the allegations against Epstein, see what accomplices are out there, what other evidence can be uncovered. But he also made some other news in that he wants to bring back the death penalty on the federal level for prosecutions. And now he's talking about more swift executions, essentially saying he's going to move next month to speed up the use of capital punishment, specifically against convicted mass murderers. And this, of course, comes in the wake of the horrific shootings in El Paso and Dayton. So what do you make of Barr revisiting the issue in general and specifically speeding things up as well?
Yes, he said punishment must be swift and certain. If the past is our guide, the only thing that we can be certain of when we're talking about capital punishment in America is that people without resources, which is to say poor people, often poor black people, will be discriminated against in its application, which is to say that they're going to bear the brunt of this. And also that these death penalty prosecutions will be marred with all the errors that human frailty offers, including forced confessions and the like. So while I don't know that that's true in any of the most recent mass murder cases, we know in history that it's a real problem when the government tries to put people to death because there's no remedy for it. So the idea that we're going to speed up the death penalty process to anybody who cares about liberty, I think, is beyond troubling, Greg.
All right, let's head overseas and talk about liberty, and specifically Hong Kong, where the protests have been going for a number of months now. It started with the protests against the proposed extradition law, which would have made it a whole lot easier for folks in Hong Kong to be extradited to mainland China, where their liberties are far, far lesser. Now the people of Hong Kong not only want that law shelved permanently, but they're just worried about an erosion of their freedoms as we get closer and further along this transition from British to full Chinese control of Hong Kong. We've seen more violence in the streets. We saw the airport cleared a couple of days ago, and we're still kind of waiting to see what exactly is the position of the administration on this. How vociferous or non-vociferous should President Trump be on this?
Well, I think that the world is in fear, as well they should be, of another Tiananmen Square type incident where China just brutally crushes the pro-free speech, pro-democracy opposition. And that's what this is a war between right now. It's between the Communist Party of China and their tentacles through to these pro-democrat, pro-freedom activists in Hong Kong who, like you say, it's 22 years on now, and every year their freedoms and independence gets whittled away more and more. And this was the last straw for many of them. They had, Greg, by some accounts, over 1 million people in the streets demonstrating. So I don't know what the right move is in terms of supporting those folks, except to say that we need to support them.
Well, it always makes me think back to the 1980s when President Reagan made some moves. I mean, he did move weapons into West Germany and so forth, but it was the power of the word, along with Prime Minister Thatcher and Pope John Paul II, that seemed to be a major factor in helping to at least spur the solidarity movement and other pro-freedom movements in Eastern Europe. Do you think that could have the same effect now?
It's hard to imagine that it couldn't. I mean, I remember those words as well, and Reagan's command of the language to really turn the world's attention on. And I would hope that President Trump would use his Twitter feed and his words to do likewise. So far, he has kind of been relatively silent on the issue.
Speaking of China, let's close on the issue of tariffs, because we've had a back and forth between the U.S. and China over tariffs lately. But this past week, and investors seem to like this, the president said he was going to hold off on the latest round of tariffs, not because he was getting something for it, but because he didn't want American consumers to be having to pay more as they shop for Christmas presents. So he says it'll basically come back in after that. What's your sense of where we are in this trade battle and this particular decision?
Well, it's $30 million worth of taxes or tariffs that the administration has said they will suspend. So that's $30 million, which will be in the hands of Americans. And so I think it's great news. And I think that what's more troubling is this notion that the president can just levy these massive tariffs at his whim or decide not to. It seems to be a relatively despotic type of power that we've given the president that the Congress has given the president, the ability to implement these tariffs willy-nilly or remove them. So I think any time that the American people have less money confiscated from them by the government, that's a good thing. But perhaps it's a good idea to revisit this plenary power the president exercises.
There's been a lot of talk, obviously, Scott, about the growing power of the executive. And, of course, whenever a given party has control of the White House, they're not going to be really excited to have their president not have as much power. So rolling it back seems to be a persistent challenge. Is it something that you think can ever happen?
You know, you'd hope that the people who think that Trump himself is an awful president would be amenable to the notion that we should reduce presidential power. That hasn't been the case, but But maybe if and when he, as Tim has predicted, will win re-election, they'll see the light on that one, Greg.
We'll see. Indeed. Scott, busy week as always. Really important topics that need the attention of the American people far more than some of the things that are in the headlines all the time. Chris Cuomo getting into a dust-up, Miley Cyrus breaking up with her husband. I think these stories are slightly more important. Always good to have you with us. Thanks for your time.
Fredo abides. Thank you, Greg.
Scott Cosenza is legal affairs editor at LibertyNation.com. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America, sitting in for Tim Donner this week. When we come back, how well is the government spending your tax dollars? You already know the answer, but we'll take a close look at how money from the Small Business Administration is getting spent when we talk with the CEO of OpenTheBooks.com right after this on Liberty Nation.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
I'm Greg Corombos, sitting in for Tim Donner this week. My guest at this time is OpenTheBooks.com founder and CEO Adam Andrzejewski. His group is out with a new report questioning how the government is actually using our tax dollars. This time, the focus is on the Small Business Administration, also known as the SBA. And Adam, thanks very much for being with us.
Greg, thanks for having me on the program. Thank you very much for your interest in our oversight report.
Well, let's start with the premise for the report. Why did you decide to take a deep dive into the SBA?
Well, the SBA, their public persona is that they help mom and pop businesses on Main Street. Those men and women, the great entrepreneurs of this country that have good ideas but cannot find financing in the private marketplace. And that's where the SBA supposedly comes in to extend the credit and make the loan. So we gave oversight to that premise, and here's what we found. We found that $117 million flowed into zip code 90210. Greg, that's Beverly Hills, California. We found $120 million over the course of the past 5 years flowed into America's private country clubs, golf clubs, swim clubs, beach clubs, yacht clubs, and tennis clubs across the country. Then we found that $12 billion of SBA lending activity didn't go to Main Street at all. It went to Wall Street, funding large investment pools, hedge fund managers, and investment managers.
How does this happen?
Well, I think there's been a lack of oversight in Congress. There's been congressional underreach toward the executive agencies. And so Congress needs to start asking hard questions of the SBA. For example, why should working and middle-class taxpayers subsidize loans to the wealthy lifestyle? We found $60 million went to plastic surgeon and aesthetic enhancement surgery clinics. We found $20 million went to high-end luxury helicopter companies. We found $70 million supported wineries, and the list goes on and on.
We're talking with Adam Andrzejewski. He is the founder and CEO at OpenTheBooks.com. And Adam, I'm guessing, and I don't know if you've gotten this pushback yet, but I can imagine someone saying, well, yeah, Beverly Hills is really rich, and there's a lot of really rich people there, but the cost to actually open a successful business there could also be much higher than it is somewhere else. So it might not be bankrolling movie stars and folks on Rodeo Drive necessarily, but it could be folks trying to just launch a business and they're struggling to do so. So break down what we're learning and what you're learning by the zip codes and who actually is getting this kind of money.
So, for instance, in Beverly Hills, California, and that's zip codes 90210, 90211, and 90212, specific recipients included doctors with practices on Wilshire Boulevard, a high fashion design school, retailers selling alligator leather belts for $750 and cowboy boots for $3,400. $1.75 million of SBA loans went to a 30-year-old importer of French wines, and $2.1 million supported an eyeglass designer whose frames are worn by the movie stars Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt.
So what do we know about what Main Street's getting? We know it's not the percentage of the loans that perhaps should be going out. But what impact can we see from your research as to how real mom and pop stores are being helped or not being helped by the SBA?
Well, it's a great question. So over the course of the past 5 years, the SBA has lent $170 billion. $170 billion. Now, there's been 230,000 loans, less than 50 grand. But that only amounts to less than $5 billion of a total portfolio of $170 billion. So mom and pop businesses on Main Street, they're definitely getting short-sheeted by the SBA.
What does this tell us? Does this mean that friends of powerful people are getting help that they don't necessarily need from the taxpayer, or is there another lesson here?
So I think one of the lessons and one of the takeaways is that the sheer number of $1 million plus loans is escalating, and it was up by almost 1,100 $1 million loans just last year over the previous year. So that's one lesson. Another lesson is that the Congress needs to hold oversight hearings, because we found when we banded the SBA loans on $1 million of face amount and above, it's now 57%, almost 60 cents on every dollar of face amount lending goes to a recipient who gets $1 million or more. So we actually mapped the 40,000 recipients of $1 million loans by zip code across the entire country. So you can go to openthebooks.com, and if you click on the reports, our oversight report, the electronic copy, we've got a link to that map, and you can search in your own backyard who literally won the SBA $1 million loan lottery. And it represents 2 out of every 3 communities where there's a recipient all across the country.
Adam, we just saw in the past couple of days that after the first 10 months of fiscal year 2019, the deficit is bigger than it's ever been before, and it's not because revenues are paltry. So when you talk about Congress needing to do oversight here, it seems like Congress needs to do better oversight just about everywhere. So what's your overall assessment of the job Congress is doing, and what's your advice for where they ought to start?
Well, the budget agreement just may have been the worst budget agreement in the history of the country. For all the partisan rancor, it seems like both parties can agree to spend more of our money, Greg. So you have Republicans who've castigated Democrats as tax and spend, and Republicans have now proven once again that they are the party of tax cut and spend. Both parties love spending our money.
And you mentioned the budget deal. We've also had a series of omnibus and budget crisis shutdown type resolutions and continuing resolutions. In other words, we don't really have regular order anymore. It's been tried. The House did it for a while. They're under Republican control, and then the Senate couldn't get the 60 votes necessary to do it on that side. So we've pretty much just been going from massive omnibus to massive omnibus with a few continuing resolutions thrown in the middle. How do we get out of this rut?
Well, it doesn't look like we're going to get out of it over the course of the next 2 years. This budget agreement is for 2 years, and in order to effectuate it, they do have to pass 12 appropriations bills back to the omnibus spending bills and let the agencies figure out how to spend the largesse that Congress throws at them.
And finally, you have talked before in our conversations about how the American people have got to hold their representatives accountable, demand better performance in guarding the tax dollars and making sure they're spent in a more efficient way. But a lot of times when politicians promise to tighten the belt, they don't get a great response, because ultimately they're willing to look at cutting spending just about everywhere, because there's usually bloat in just about every part of the government. And eventually you're going to get to something that person cares about. And so therefore, they're skittish to support that candidate. How big of a problem is that?
So I think what you're speaking to is the lack of political will and the lack of political leadership. I want to leave you with a great unfolding story. When the president won for office, he put forth an executive order to freeze executive agency payrolls. We just got the payroll headcount information finally after 7 months of wrangling with the Office of Personnel Management. It's the 2018 headcount file in the executive agencies, and every single executive agency is down fairly sharply on their headcount. So the president and his secretaries have been able to cut the blow to the federal bureaucracy. They're up sharply in the agencies where the president campaigned. At the VA, the president promised to take care of the veterans. Their payroll is up 18,000 federal workers. And over at the Department of Homeland Security, obviously the president promised to secure the border, and he made promises on immigration. Their payroll is actually up 21,000 employees. Everywhere else, it's down sharply. And so outside of the president's promises, he has cut the bloat in the federal bureaucracy.
So on the personnel side, there seems to be some progress. Folks will be happy to hear that. But in terms of actual program spending, seems like the job is yet to be done. Adam, thank you very much for your time with us today. Congratulations on the new report, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you soon.
Greg, thank you. Thanks for your interest in our work.
Adam Andrzejewski is the CEO and founder of OpenTheBooks.com. Again, OpenTheBooks.com if you want more information there. I'm Greg Corombos, sitting in for Tim Donner this week. Tim will be back behind the microphone next week, and until then, stand up for liberty.